So the market revolution, ladies and gentlemen, what we need to understand is that there was a time, like when you look back at our original economy, okay, that you're dealing with farmers. America was founded as a nation of farmers. Now, this is part of the reason why Thomas Jefferson was was so big into farming and agriculture, because that was the traditional economy of the United States, and it seemed to make sense at the time. Certainly, there's a lot of fertile land here, and when Jefferson purchased Louisiana, he's looking for even more farmers. And so, as far as that goes, this is the original economy. Now, the market revolution is really seeing how our economy is becoming more technologically advanced, more commercial, and more, just market driven. Okay, so let's go ahead and just remind about some things about the market revolution. So as far as that goes, let's see here. Let's see. Okay. And so as far as that goes, we want to take a look at the new technologies and the rise of market capitalism. I think we looked at a little bit of this stuff last time, but I don't mind going over it again. Now, remember, this isn't that fancy, so just bear with me. But basically, you're looking at these new technologies, okay? So steamboats become the primary mode of mass freight transportation. Now, before this, if you wanted to get crops to market, let's say that you are a farmer in Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, all of that kind of stuff, you are getting your crops to New Orleans. So you get on to the Mississippi River, you get on a barge that your stuff gets onto this barge, you float down river, and you bring it over there. Now, of course, with steamboats, now traffic can go either way. The steamboat is really the first time where you've got ships that can easily go either way on the Mississippi River. Okay, so as far as that is concerned, then what you're looking at now is that we've got a new and more efficient mode of mass freight transportation, the steamboat. Now, railroads, let's be very, very careful. Let's not put railroads into here until about the 1850s, okay? So once we get to the 1850s, then we're going to be fine there, okay? But until then, it's steamboats, turnpikes, and canals, okay? Turnpikes being toll roads. Now, in some parts of the country, they still refer to toll roads as turnpikes. Like if you live in New Jersey or something like that, then you're familiar with this language. Other parts of the country, you may not be. But when we talk about turnpikes, we're talking about toll roads, okay? And then another technology, of course, is the cotton gin, which, of course, brings about cotton agriculture in the antebellum period. It was invented by Eli Whitney, who was a New Englander in about the 1790s. Now, the rise of market capitalism, okay? So when we talk about the market revolution, we're looking at the investment of capital in business enterprise. And in a lot of ways, this was really kind of the triumph of the Hamiltonian sort of mindset that, when he was thinking about the national bank, this is where we can pool together capital for business. And of course, we've got the rise of the corporation, which I mentioned last week as well, that you've got limited liability. So when there's a corporation, only the money in the corporation is at risk. So if I invested $1,000 in a steamship corporation, then $1,000 is all I have risked. I can't ever, now I could lose the entire $1,000, but nobody can come at me and demand any of my other money that I haven't put in there. The other thing a corporation does is it allows multiple people to combine their investments. And so you can have, if you have 1,000 people putting up $1,000, then what are you looking at? I guess $1 million. Okay, $1 million. Some of y'all might be a little too young for Dr. Evil, but you can combine investments. So this is encouraging investment, and so you have piles of money to start business, okay, capital that you hadn't had previously in the United States. So we start to see the beginnings of the big business that we're going to see later on in the Gilded Age after the Civil War. And then there is emphasis on the self-made man, okay? Now, this is the idea when you look back, okay, when you look back at Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, even John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, which, you know, this family was already, the Adams family was pretty established in Massachusetts. And so Jackson is really the first president that really came from nowhere. All right, that he was somebody whose family was not connected. I don't think the guy even knew who his father was, and so self-made. Now remember also, now even though the market revolution can be seen in some ways as the triumph of Hamiltonian thought, it is still very much in terms of limited government interference. So there's still a very Jeffersonian spirit about this, that there is a skepticism about using government money, to do things like internal improvements and stuff like that. There is hesitance about giving government money to corporations. So really the government is playing a more limited role than it will play later. Okay, so as far as that goes, now remember Henry Clay's American system. Henry Clay, one of the leaders of the Whig Party, and multiple times the presidential candidate, never won. A national bank, internal improvements, and the protective tariff. Okay, national bank, internal improvements, and protective tariff. Now, internal improvements, we mean specifically government funded roads, bridges, canals, railroads, and stuff like that. And of course, a protective tariff in order to help to promote American industry and protect it from foreign competition. So that is my spiel on the market revolution. Yeah, I did that last time. Now, yes, I know it really does. Yeah, it's something like I can't make Lord of the Rings references anymore because it's gotten to where my class, like the whole class practically hasn't seen Lord of the Rings. It's really, really tough. Okay, so as far as that goes, Luke, hopefully you can see me now and all of that. We've got lots of questions here. Excellent, excellent. Y'all tell your friends that we're here. All right, and what were the antebellum movements? Okay, I am guessing that you were talking about the antebellum reform movements. Okay, so the antebellum reform movements, these movements were, really we're starting with the Second Great Awakening. Okay, so let me go back actually, and let me before I do that, I'm gonna, well, you know what, I'm just gonna kind of go straight into the Second Great Awakening because I really have to talk about that to establish context. Now, remember that on your exam, establishing context, that is really like this kind of big picture sort of thing here. And so giving some useful background information, okay? So as far as that goes, I'm going to go into the Second Great Awakening, then go into the antebellum reform movements, okay? So the Second Great Awakening, all right, there are some commonalities with the First Great Awakening, that both of them included emotional preaching, hellfire and brimstone, calculated to scare the congregation or the audience or whatever you want to call it. And so the only difference here, though, is that while the First Great Awakening was influenced heavily by Calvinism, which of course is a philosophy that God has already chosen who's going to heaven, who's going to hell. And so Calvinists, like, when you think about sinners in the hands of an angry God, it's like, okay, your salvation is pretty much entirely in God's hands. You are hanging by a thread, and all you can really do is to just you just be scared and just have a healthy fear of God. Now, the Second Great Awakening is influenced by a viewpoint called Arminianism. Okay, now Arminianism is or really, I mean, you don't necessarily have to know that term for the APUSH exam. Okay, but it's something that contrasts with Calvinism. That Arminianism is the idea that, like in religious circles, the idea that people get to have some kind of choice over whether they go to heaven or whether they go to hell. And so as far as that goes, it's more heavily influenced by this thought, which is very American, that it's really democratized in a sense, that really I have some say. And if I'm going to if I'm going to, if I'm actually a Christian, if I've actually converted, then I'm going to live a good life. And that is my choice. And so this is the whole idea. Like, you think about, like, Kanye said slavery is a choice. He took a lot of flack for that, right? But at the same time, the Second Great Awakening, it's like going to hell is a choice, being evil is a choice, owning slaves is a choice, drinking alcohol is a choice, putting someone in an asylum that is filthy and dirty and they're treated like an animal is a choice. And so we can make a choice to make the world better, essentially. So the Second Great Awakening is really, it provides the context for everything that comes after in the antebellum reform movements. Okay, so it comes after that, and it's driven by this, because the thing is that now it's like owning slaves is a choice. It's not like somebody's just kind of a victim. Like, this is where, and it kind of gets into one of the other questions that I can see here that that Kate is asking, that when we think about, like, slavery in terms of, for example, in 1820, when Thomas Jefferson heard about the Missouri Compromise, he was very, very, very apprehensive. Okay, he was not, he wasn't feeling very good about it, because what Jefferson said is that the South, when it comes to slavery, the South has the wolf by the ear. Okay, meaning that, if you got a wolf by the ear, it's like it's going to stay where you want it. But at the same time, exactly, Raphael, he heard the death knell of the Union, because the way he saw it, he had slavery by the ear. And if you let go of that wolf's ear, that wolf is going to tear you to pieces. And so Jefferson really, it's like, here's the guy that wrote the Declaration of Independence, a big freedom guy, but he felt like he didn't really have much of a choice. Now, of course, you go to his house and you see where his, couple dozen servants that were just there in the house. He lived a very, very nice life. Probably could have let a few people go and been fine, right? But at the same time, he saw that there's really not much that can be done about slavery. It's just what is, and that's really the point of view of that founding generation, and to a certain extent that 1812 generation. And then you've got the Second Great Awakening, and people start thinking, like, you know what? This is actually an evil that we could do something about. And it doesn't have to be pragmatic, because remember, the Second Great Awakening, it's about getting yourself right with God. And so what's the use of having a good economy if you're going to go to hell because your economy is evil? This is how abolitionists think. They're really almost like the first social justice warriors, if you want to think about it that way. That the abolitionists, they're saying, look, we want to get rid of slavery everywhere. We want to get rid of it now. Instead of, hey, we can't really do anything about slavery, and let's just kind of do what we can about it. American Colonization Society, we'll send a few back every year and pat ourselves on the back. So for one, abolitionism. Now remember, abolitionism, William Lloyd Garrison, the liberator. Okay, Frederick Douglass is another notable abolitionist who wrote a slave narrative, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And so as far as that goes, that's abolitionism. Now, temperance is the next one. I've got a video on temperance on my YouTube channel. I'm kind of fond of it, so check that out. But temperance is the anti-alcohol movement. Now, that affects us today, because when you turn 18, you're not going to be like somebody in practically any other Western country where you can buy alcohol, but you are going to have to wait until you're 21, just like in, I think, a handful of predominantly Muslim countries in Asia. Last time I checked, it's the United States and a handful of predominantly Muslim countries in Asia. And you ask yourself, why is this the case? Why is that happening? And so as far as that goes, it really goes back to the temperance movement, this idea that, of course, yes, exactly. Now, this idea that religion, and like the Christian religion, being a good Christian, okay, being a good evangelical Protestant Christian goes hand in hand with not consuming alcohol. Now, of course, today you probably know people who consume alcohol in moderation, people who are legal adults and consume alcohol in moderation. But then again, I think that now, the average American drinks about 2 gallons of pure alcohol per year, which means that, yeah, it's just the average American doesn't really drink a whole lot. Now, just pure alcohol, okay? If you were just to break down everything, like think about like a beer is like 5% of that is alcohol. So if you were to put all of the alcohol the average American consumes, think some don't consume any, but about 2 gallons, I believe. Now, at that time, the average American consumed about 7 gallons of pure alcohol. This was when a lot of the water wasn't all that great, and the alcohol was really like, that kind of maybe kept you from getting sick. I don't know, but they drank a lot more alcohol than you see people drinking now. And these people didn't really, these people on the frontier, especially, didn't have a whole lot to do. And of course, some people don't respond very well to alcohol, and they do things that they wouldn't do if they were sober. And a lot of women who had also been involved in the abolition movement are also involved in the temperance movement to try to get laws passed that are making it either banning alcohol entirely or just making it difficult to get alcohol, like the 15-gallon Act in New England and Massachusetts, I believe, at that time, and which is hard to talk about that state now. I'm a Dodgers fan, so we didn't do so well last night, did we? But as far as that goes, we've got that. Now, when you think about abolitionism and temperance, all right, then you think about what comes later in the antebellum period is the women's rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, because a lot of the people who were active in these abolition societies and the temperance societies, people who were major organizers, these were upper middle class women, like people who didn't have a job or anything like that, and they had a nanny and all of that, all of the comforts of life, dealing with their children, whatnot. And it's kind of like today, like a woman joining the junior league or something like that. And so as far as that goes, that you start to see women saying, hey, we should have political rights. We shouldn't just be restricted to organizing these reform movements. And so the Seneca Falls Convention, exactly, Haruko, 1848, the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, which is modeled after the Declaration of Independence. And so as far as that goes, you got another one. Now, then you've got a few more. I would mention public education, Horace Mann. Okay, what year? 1848. There's actually a song called Seneca Falls by this woman-fronted punk rock band, and maybe an all-girl punk rock band. Let me see here what I can find, because the song is called Seneca Falls. Okay, people, my goodness. All right, so let's go back here, and yeah, exactly. What? Okay, I don't know if he already knew it, or did he just did he already know it, or did he just find it on YouTube faster than I did? But yes, this band called the Distillers. And the reason I always remember this is the song starts, the year was 1848, New York State. And so remember, 1848 rhymes with New York State. And so if you remember that, then you can remember the year of the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, also, one thing to note is that one of your APUSH periods, now I don't like numbered periods, so I don't think about them that way, but one of your numbered periods ends or begins in 1848. So 1848 is really kind of that time, and it's also the time of the end of the Mexican-American War. So you're really starting to transition in 1848 out of the Jacksonian era and into this time of the Civil War, coming on the horizon. Okay, so as far as that goes, okay. So going into that now, Horace Mann, public education. That's something to remember. Now, of course, this is basically like elementary education. This isn't high school education. This is just making sure that everybody in the state of Massachusetts knows reading, writing, arithmetic, that sort of thing. And so as far as that goes, so so then Dorothea Dix, prison and asylum reform. So think about that. All right. So as far as that goes, let's see, what were Jackson's intentions? Kendall, you were struggling with this one. Okay. So what were Jackson's intentions, or what did he bring to America? Now, Jackson was the leader of the Democratic Party, which, remember, there was a time between the first party system and the second party system, this era of good feelings. And what happened here was there's kind of like a it's not like the Federalists. Now, the Federalist Party ceased to exist, but it's not like they just completely surrendered to the Republicans. Kind of like when we think about the ratification of the Constitution, that it's not that the Anti-Federalists just up and lost or anything like that. That they got to influence the Constitution. Okay, they got to influence the Constitution. And so, as far as that goes, they have a chance to, the Bill of Rights, the creature of the Anti-Federalists. And so, the Federalist Party kind of, Henry Clay was a Republican per se, but he is, he's coming up with this American system, which is a very Hamiltonian idea. And so after this chaotic election of 1824, there's this kind of like, all right, Jeffersonians over here, Hamiltonians over here. And you start to see that the Jacksonian party is very much very much in the Jeffersonian camp. Okay, so the Jacksonian part, the Democrats. Okay, so Jackson, the Democrats, they favored states' rights. Okay, they favored no national bank. They believed in a laissez-faire economy, a strict construction of the Constitution. And so with Jackson now, of course, they are full-fledged democracy. Like Jefferson had maybe a little bit of a troubled kind of relationship with democracy. Like Jefferson was a guy who believed in freedom. He was a classical liberal, but he wasn't so sure, when you look at some of his writings, wasn't so sure that the common people were quite ready to have like a share in government. Whereas Jackson believed that the more democratic we can make things, the better, that the little guy has a role in the government. Now, of course, Jackson takes a lot of flack for things like Indian removal, and that really the things that he did only benefited white guys. But at the same time, if you didn't have universal white male suffrage. Okay, so before Jackson comes along, and it's not like Jackson just unilaterally did this, but before the Jacksonian era, you've got, basically some white males can vote, some can't, based on their standing, their property ownership, and all of that. And once all of the white males can vote, then people start thinking, well, what about us? So white females at Seneca Falls are thinking, why can't I vote? And then, of course, in the Reconstruction Amendments, you see where you can't tell any man that they can't vote because of race, color, previous condition of servitude. So although Jackson, I mean, you people tend to hold some historical figures like to impossible standards that go way beyond whatever was possible in their time. But, the United States became more democratic under Jackson, more egalitarian. There was more room for the little guy at the table during this time. So I think that Jackson was somebody who created a great deal of progress in terms of equality. Although if we look at it with our standards of today, then we may not be very impressed. And so let's take a look at this. Okay, so how have the viewpoints of slavery changed pre-Civil War? Okay, now what we want to start with, Kate, remember that when we get into the antebellum period, we're going from 1820 to 1860. Okay, 1820 to 1860. Now, the reason why they're picking 1820, all right, is because the reason why they're picking 1820 is because they are the reason they're picking 1820 is because of the Missouri Compromise. Sorry, sometimes. All right, but 1820, the reason why they're picking that is because the Missouri Compromise. All right, so that's where Jefferson's like, uh-oh, death knell. All right, wolf by the ear, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so there were two things that I think that if you look at the founding generation, there were two assumptions. First of all, slavery is something that we're not crazy about and we're not proud of. Second of all, the Southern economy pretty much needs it. All right, those were the two assumptions about slavery. So you saw that the northern states after the American Revolution abolished slavery, most of them gradually. Like there were still slaves in New Jersey in the 1860 census. Now, by most states have completely gotten rid of it by then, but several states got rid of slavery gradually. So there are still slaves in these states, just not many. But what's happening, though, is that slavery is something we're not proud of, but slavery's pretty much necessary. And of course, what happens with the cotton gin, I mean, when you think about it, like let's go back to the Constitution, that the 3/5 compromise, that essentially in return for allowing slaves to count as 3/5 of the person, then Congress could cut off the foreign slave trade in 20 years. Well, what happened was Congress cut off the foreign slave trade, but the slave population still grew. And because of the cotton gin and cotton agriculture, the importance of slavery grew during this time. And so what you see here is that attitudes start to change because, first of all, it starts to look like slavery is not going anywhere right now, and it's stronger than ever in the South. And yeah, so the cotton gin, like, really just it increased the profitability of slavery, at least during this time. Okay, now we could get into alternate history scenarios, which I think is fun, but just not that necessarily for APUSH, that how long would slavery have existed after the Civil War? But during the antebellum period, slavery was extremely profitable in the cotton producing states because of the cotton gin. And so the thing is, no longer is slavery something that is on the way out. Okay, so slavery's not on the way out. We're not getting rid of it. And then the other side of that is that Southern slaveholders. Now, on one side, you've got abolitionists like you've got. Well, I was about to say Abraham Lincoln. No. Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. That's free soil coming later. But you have these anti-slavery movements. Okay, so these anti-slavery movements are sprouting up in the North. And one thing I tell people who aren't from the South, and I think this is true of people in general, but especially Southerners, that if you tell a Southerner that they're wrong about something, then they just became more right. And so what happens here is that slavery is becoming more economically profitable and more a part of the Southern economy. And you have abolitionists in the North who are calling for its complete obliteration immediately, even sending pamphlets down to the South and stuff like that. And so there is this very defensive reaction where a lot of these Southern slaveholders, they start to get in this mindset that, this really isn't that bad. And in fact, now Calhoun wasn't the first person to make this point, but his 1837 speech is often quoted as really kind of the most accessible explanation of this, where Calhoun says that that slavery is a positive good because it keeps the racial hierarchy where nature intended it, as he says, his words, not mine. All right. And so as far as that goes, then Calhoun is really this like in the mid 1830s, about 4 years after William Lloyd Garrison publishes the first issue of the Liberator. So on one hand, you've got this push from Northern anti-slavery movements, and then there's a push back from Southern slaveholders that's like, hey, this really is, this is a good thing. It helps everybody involved. So that's where things are going. Now, of course, what happens in the 1850s, you start to see the prevalence of the free soil movement. And the free soil movement take out the moral elements, the moral elements of the abolitionist. And it's much more set on that these are Northerners who want to move out west, and they don't want to live around black people, and they don't want to compete with slave labor. And so they want to keep slavery in the South. Okay. And this is really what's going to become the big issue, is not so much whether slavery should exist in Alabama, but whether slavery should exist in Kansas. And that is the big, that's the big question there. So I think that answers your question as far as the things that provoke. Remember the cotton gin, then the profitability of cotton agriculture, and of course, anti-slavery movements in the North and the pressure that Southern slaveholders are seeing to start to get rid of slavery, where they are more dependent on it than they have ever been. And so, how did the transition of parties from Democrat? Okay, so as far as that goes, now one thing, Haruko, and I'm not going to hold it against you because I think that's what the redesigned exam does. I prefer to call them the Jeffersonian Republican Party, but your exam will probably say Democratic Republican because the thing is, I feel like Democratic Republican is kind of misleading because it just kind of it shows a little too much continuity between the Jeffersonian Party and the Jacksonian Party, even though I can see some ideological continuity there. But the transition, okay, the transition here, you're welcome, Kate, is really taking place. And it's just pretty much, just think about it. After the War of 1812, Federalist Party's gone. So former Federalists start to become Republicans. And so what you see in, with Jefferson and Madison, okay, during the time of the two-party system, what you had here was Jefferson and Madison and their presidency. So Jefferson makes Madison his Secretary of State. Then Madison becomes the next president. Then Madison makes Monroe the Secretary of State, also a Virginian. This is the Virginia dynasty, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and each chose the next as his Secretary of State. Now, when James Monroe gets elected president, this is the beginning of the era of good feelings after the War of 1812. So what happens here is Monroe, what he does, and this is what really precipitates the era of good feelings, is he makes John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts his Secretary of State. And by doing that, he's really showing like what we might call bipartisanship. Okay, so it's really what you're seeing is just an era where the parties are less polarized than they were before. But then that doesn't hold because in 1824, you had the really chaotic election of 1824 where Jackson got the most electoral votes, but he didn't get a majority. And so since Jackson didn't get a majority of the electoral votes, then that was, then he had to go to the House. And then Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams were making deals, or at least so we think. I mean, come on, we're not stupid. The corrupt bargain, exactly. And so the corrupt bargain was something that really kind of galvanized everyone again. Now, what had happened was that in 1824, both Adams and Jackson had selected John C. Calhoun as their running mate. They both thought that they would have an advantage by having John C. Calhoun on their ticket. And so what you have with Calhoun and Adams is Calhoun was Adams' vice president, but then he goes to the Jacksonian faction. And so from then on, what you're going to see is really kind of like, okay, Jeffersonians over here, Hamiltonians over here, and we're going to have a second two-party system. And so you start to see that form with the election of 1828, where Jackson and Calhoun are running against, John Quincy Adams and whoever his running mate was in 1828. Doesn't matter. He lost, right? So there you go. And Lily, that's such a great question. Such a great question. Was it really an era of good feelings? And that's really one of those things that's more for interpretation than anything else. Somebody could make an argument either way. That's probably why you've had that as a, as a prompt or something like that. All right. Katie, the significance of the Romantic era. Okay. Now, the thing is, this is something I'm going to consult the course description here because this is something that's definitely a big deal for AP Euro, but not quite. Let's see. So let's see. Okay. All right, so there is something like a little bit there. Let's see, communicate something, does the sources, okay. So there's a little almost like a footnote or something like that. It's not something that figures heavily in here. I remember before the exam was redesigned, I remember seeing a question about the Hudson River School, but I wouldn't put a lot of stock into this, into Romanticism for the yeah, I wouldn't say here, let's see, liberal social ideas from abroad and romantic beliefs in human perfectibility influenced art, philosophy, and literature. Now, this is just something that's like very, very like, it's just a sub point of a sub point. So I would not, unless this is something your teacher's really into, I wouldn't think about that. Now, one thing I would note, I don't know, Katie, if you've taken AP Euro before, but romantic art, it's like landscape paintings, like the Hudson River School was that kind of thing. And of course, you've got some of the literature at the time is romantic, but at the same time, I would not consider that a major theme of APUS history or anything like that, anything worth giving any more attention to than your teacher tells you to. I personally, in my classes, in my APUSH classes, I never even mention it, but I do harp on that a good bit in my AP Euro class. All right, so the bank war. Okay, the bank war. Okay, we're going to start answering that. All right, so when it comes down to it, Andrew Jackson. Okay, so Jackson was a strict constructionist when it came to the reading of the Constitution. All right, so Jackson was a strict constructionist, much like Jefferson, and Jackson wasn't a big fan of the national bank, and basically, there's the other thing here is that he had a rivalry with the president of the Second Bank of the United States. So not only did Jackson not like the bank, now Jackson believed that the bank was something that made rich people richer. All right. And this is the sort of thing, like, although Jackson was a laissez-faire guy, he was in some ways the Bernie of his time. Okay. Like, he was really in some ways the Bernie Sanders of his time, that he was the guy that was like, look, the system is rigged. Okay. And what he believed was like, look, that when you look at the Bank of the United States, and you look at who the shareholders are. The shareholders, so the government has its hand in it, but also you've got these shareholders who are rich people, and among them are foreigners, Jackson says. It's like, why is it that we've got these rich people and foreigners that are being helped out by our government, basically, when when all of the shares and all that are distributed, all the dividends, that, the government should belong to everybody. And so for Jackson, he believed that the government should work for all of the people. And he believed that the bank was not serving that. And also the banks never mentioned the Constitution. And Jackson also believed that the bank was a violation of the rights of the states. And so he believed that the federal government did not have the authority to bank, that really that is the job of the state governments. And so with all of that, Jackson, and then he's going against Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay thought that there would be some political opportunity in making the bank an issue. Okay, so making the bank an issue, he thought there'd be an opportunity. Now, Jackson ended up being on the right side of that. Now, the thing is, a lot of times when somebody makes a campaign about one issue, then that can be a little bit risky, okay? Because what if the public's not with you on that issue? And evidently, like, the public really didn't have a strong opinion for the national bank. Henry Clay decided when he ran against Jackson in 1832 that he wanted to make the election a referendum on the bank. Okay, so that's what he was going for. He wanted a referendum on the bank. Exactly. Nicholas Biddle. And so the thing is that the charter wasn't supposed to expire until 1836. And so Henry Clay's like 1832, let's push it in and let's make this an election issue. And so Jackson vetoed the bank bill. And as I mentioned, it's not in the Constitution. It makes rich people richer, that it's a violation of the rights of the states. Now, Jackson claimed, and who knows if he was sincere about this or not, he said that there may be some national bank bills that he might have gone along with, but not this particular one. Now, of course, sometimes when you're reading a veto message, people will say that. It's kind of like George W. Bush always said that if an assault weapons ban came across his desk, he would sign it. Now, he knew that bill was never coming onto his desk. And so there are times when that happens. But Jackson, wins this bank war because he didn't recharter the bank, and he won the election of 1832, which Henry Clay decided to try to make a referendum on the bank. But remember, a lot of times, especially in democratic countries, people vote for the candidate, for the person, not so much for a particular issue. And so as far as that goes, Zoe, I think I've already answered your question here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that because I have answered that, which some other people have asked. Andre, to what extent was the decade of crisis a valid title for the 1850s? Andre, you trying to get me to do your homework for you? Let me invite Andre on screen. Nobody ever takes me up on my offer. Okay. And yes, Lily, to your question, Jackson did do some things. The spoil system, this was definitely something that was unprecedented when Jackson basically went through and just fired everybody. He did some things that other people had not previously done. Okay, so let's see. Is Andre going to join me or not? I don't know. But this sounds like somebody just got a writing prompt or something like that. That's really, all of these things are subjective, okay? Because you could say that there's a decade of crisis. Certainly the evidence, mounts up, because when you see the polarization, now that's, of course, something, it's an AP government term, but it's when the two parties are at each other's throats. And of course, the slavery issue, and specifically the issue of the expansion of slavery. And also, another thing we want to note is in the 1850s, you see the collapse of the second two-party system. So the Whig Party, after the 1852 election, collapses as a national entity, and largely because of disagreements between Northern and Southern Whigs over slavery. And so as far as that goes, the Whig Party, Whig Party ceases to exist. And so you've got some instability from that. You've got a lot of immigrants coming in. And of course, there's a nativist backlash there. The anti-Masonic Party. Now, that was during the Jacksonian era, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I think that may have been the 1832 election. I think that's before this time, Haruko. But from there, you've got the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was passed along party lines. Franklin Pierce, a very good-looking man, wasn't able to run for re-election. Where is Handsome Frank? I don't know. I used to have a bobblehead. I've got it somewhere. I just don't know where it is. I've got a Franklin Pierce bobblehead that the New Hampshire Historical Society thought would be a great idea to make. And so as far as that goes, I think it was a decade of crisis. Of course, then again, you've got, the free soil movement that's picking up steam. And then, of course, the very chaotic election of 1860. So, yeah, this is just one of those questions. It sounds like you're trying to get me to do your homework for you, but I would lean toward yes. All right. Okay. Now, the Haruko, the kitchen cabinet. Okay, so the kitchen cabinet, that's kind of a just a thing like Jackson relied on informal advisors. Now, and it's not just Jackson. If you think about President Trump relies a lot on informal advisors. His daughter and his son-in-law work very closely with him in his administration. I would say that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner are members of President Trump's kitchen cabinet. These are people who are not members of the formal cabinet. Now, some presidents lean very heavily on their formal cabinet, which, that they got to pick them. But then again, remember, there's a caveat there, that the caveat here is they get to pick them, but they have to go through the Senate for confirmation. And so a kitchen cabinet, this is a group of informal advisors who then are going to give you advice, which every president that's in recent memory has political advisors. They've got their White House staff. Okay, so basically, there's no difference in the makeup of the cabinet. It's just that Jackson didn't rely very much on his cabinet. Of course, there was that petticoat affair, the petty Eaton affair, where you've got this situation where Jackson pretty much like fires or asks for the resignation of his entire cabinet over this situation with this woman who he felt sorry for, that the other women in the cabinet wouldn't hang out with because she'd been like an actress and married twice or something like that. And so with that, that's really the kitchen cabinet is just this idea that Jackson was relying heavily on informal advisors and did not have a very good relationship with his actual cabinet. I tell you what, y'all are loving Jackson's cabinet. Now, did Jackson hire only his favorites? Typically, people do. Yeah, I mean, people choose their presidents choose their cabinet. But remember that, yeah, the whole kitchen cabinet thing is that Jackson relied on these informal advisors a lot more than on his actual advisors that he was supposed to have on his cabinet. And that's a president's choice, whether how much to rely on these people, how much independence to give them, and all that kind of stuff. It really depends. Like Haruko, we're probably not going to see, let's see. So when I look at Panic, okay, now the thing is that there's really, I wouldn't put too much into that. As far as that goes, like on a particular panic, the Panic of 1837. Now, the thing is that comes after the demise of the Second Bank of the United States. But remember that there was also the Panic of 1819 that came along like right after the Second Bank of the United States was chartered. So any time that there is a shakeup in the financial system, there's going to be some kind of readjustment or panic. Now, this didn't last very long, but then Martin Van Buren in his one term had two panics that happened, and so he didn't get reelected. Because remember, when the economy is bad, it's always the president's fault. Okay, so as far as that goes, Katie, I don't really know how to answer that question. I'm not really sure how to answer that question. So I don't know. That one is yeah, I don't know how to answer that one. If you can rephrase, I might take a look at it, but I'm not sure how to answer that one. All right. What events influence the Second Great Awakening? Okay, so as far as influencing the Second Great Awakening, it's really, I think on the exam, it's going to be more how did the Second Great Awakening influence the antebellum reform movements. Okay, I wouldn't get so much into what events influenced it, because that's a question I don't think I can even answer at the top of my head. But I've never seen anything about that on an exam asking what were the causal factors there. It's really like the Second Great Awakening is really more kind of like step one on this chain of events leading to the antebellum reform movements. I hope that's helpful. All right, and as far as the Know Nothing Party, okay, so the Know Nothing Party, it was really, its formal name was the American Party, which you can think the American Party, all right? And this was a nativist party. Now, one thing that we really need to understand, because immigration is a big issue right now, and you have people saying that we're a nation of immigrants, aren't we supposed to help immigrants, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, okay? And the thing is, though, when you look through U.S. history, anytime there has been a massive influx of immigrants who are not white, English speaking, and Protestant, okay, who do not meet all three of those criteria, then there's some kind of backlash. All right. So the Irish and German immigration that we saw in the 1840s and going into the 1850s, you have the whole no Irish need apply. The Irish were Catholic. They were the first very large group to come in, and that did not meet those criteria. Okay, they were white. Most of them, they spoke English. They've got their own Irish thing, but their own Irish language, but Irish people tended to speak English, but they were Catholic. And Catholic was seen as un-American. Okay, that when we think about today, about 70% of Americans identify as Christian, and of those, this country's only about close to half Protestant, that about a third of the people who identify as Christians in this country are Catholic. And so back then, that was not the case. So the Know Nothing Party was a nativist reaction to large scale immigration. Now, of course, what happened was in the late 1840s, the Irish potato famine happened, and then you had the revolutions of 1848. So, and then some order was established after that. So this wave of immigration kind of took care of itself. But the Know Nothing Party, what you need to know more than anything, need to know something about the Know Nothing Party, right, is that it was a nativist response to the wave of Irish immigration. And also you can talk about German. Now, remember that German immigration, like there are a lot of groups that come in like large waves. German immigration is kind of like trickle, 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 just all through like U.S. history. And if you say that English and Scottish, people of English and Scottish ancestry are two different groups, German is the number one ancestry of Americans. Now, if you combine English and Scottish, then that's going to be the largest. Okay, yes, and so you've got not only the Catholicism but cheap labor. Another thing about this is that they would get involved in party machines, like Democratic Party machines. At that time, the Democratic Party was getting the support of immigrants, and so people who were of the Whig Party. Now, the Know Nothing Party and the Republican Party were the two parties that tried to be the successor party to the Whig Party. So in 1856, you had the Know Nothings and the Republicans. Now, the Know Nothings picked up a lot of votes from Southern Whigs. They actually won Maryland, but the Republicans picked up a lot more support from former Northern Whigs. And eventually, like I said, that this wave of immigration just declined on its own. And so by 1860, nobody was really talking about immigration. Okay, so that's really the Know Nothing Party, a nativist response to the massive wave of Irish and German immigration that we saw during the antebellum period. And let's see. Okay, so Europe influence American culture. One thing that I would note here, Zoe, is I would think about the Monroe Doctrine, okay? That really, this is a time, now, of course, Europe is influencing American culture when you think about like Romanticism and stuff like that. I mean, there's certainly some cultural influence, but it really is also a time when you think about the Monroe Doctrine, the American system. It's a time where the United States is really distancing itself from Europe. Between the War of 1812 and World War I, the United States doesn't get involved in any European wars. And so I would say that the influence of Europe in the United States at that time was probably less than it was before, but a good question.